Hello, good morning. Welcome to Econometrics by Richard. My name is Mokobi Richard. In those lectures, I will take you through on how to estimate the structural VAR model with exogenous shocks or exogenous variables in the model. So these are our work file we've been using from the beginning of this class. But now we will basically use just inflation. We use M3 and we use OPR, open repo rate. So let's just use that to get some background of how the structural VAR looks like. Most structural VAR is good to use stray variables at times because the people that the people that talked about the structural VAR, that thought about the structural VAR, they made use of three variable. That's the three by three matrix variable. I explained to you when we are doing the VAR that's depending on the variables you have, that's depending on the kind of matrix you have. And then we use the Kolensky decomposition to do your ordering or to do your identification in order to know how your shock move. So it's vastly advisable to use a three by three matrix to run your analysis. So you can actually try to go on Google and read about structural VAR. So when you look at the works of Christopher Saints, Blanchard and Kwan, um, uh, uh, Lawrence Cristiano, Echeboam, Robert, because those guys, you see that most of the analysis was based on the three by three matrix. It makes it more simple, and I advise people to make the analysis simple when running this estimation. So based on that, let me use the variables I said. I'll use OPR, M3, and inflation. So we are saying that we want to see the shock from open repo rate to M3, that is money supply, and then to inflation. So now we open as VAR. So most time this M3, when you look at open repo rate, M3 and inflation, you see that OPR, M3 and inflation and OPR, they are in rates, but M3 is a volume. Most times when you want to estimate this analysis, it might not really work. Okay, let me just give you an instance. Let's estimate the standard VAR before estimating the structural VAR. So you go to view, you go to no, you've estimated the VAR first, then you go to proc, and then you go to estimate structural factorization. You see, it's these are you can use here to change the different kind of restriction you want, but advisable just use the Kolensky decomposition, the recursive factor A unit triangle and B diagonal, so you can see how your A looks like. You can click on the B to see how your B matrix looks like. So you can see how the B matrix looks like, and you can see how the A matrix looks like. So that's how it's going to be. You can see where the identification comes from, the variables that you will use from your model and the ones that you will not use. So you click on OK. See, it's telling you near singular matrix because the M3 is in volume. Okay, let me re-estimate it. Let me show you. Let me re-estimate it. Let's use, because we already have told you how to log your variable, how to do it using GenR. You can check my previous videos, you see it. So LM3, and then let's click on OK. So let's select on lag length criteria first. It's actually going to run. So let's select on lag length criteria. Our lag length is telling us that we can use 2. 2 as the C2 has most of the asterisk. So you go back to estimate. So it's already on 2. So we'll click on OK. We can also use let's use there's the general variables we are going to use, the structural break in order to account for any structural break. So this is it. So you go to proc, you go to estimate structural factorization. Based on what I've said, you click on OK. You can see our results. So it gives us the straight result. You can see that all the variables are significant, only C2, which is this one here, the shock from A, that is the shock from if you're ordering it now, to be the shock from OPR on what it has on inflation. You see, but this one is significant. Even this C4, C5, C6, they're all significant. So I think it's a good is actually a good estimation. So now the next thing you have to do is the impulse response analysis. Can go to impulse, and me, I like using the MCMC Monte Carlo. It's actually I like the way that the asymptotic interval. The Monte Carlo tries to use different probabilities from your estimations and giving you analysis. So I think it's much robust to me. So you can leave it like this: 1, 2, 3, OPR, LM3, and inflation. And you click on OK. So you can use your full result. So, but to me, I like specifying them so that you can actually get you can actually get good interpretations. So I like estimating it one by one. That the shock from OPR to itself, the shock from OPR, the response of LM3 to OPR shock, I like doing it like that. So these first plates are the shocks of open repo rates. This is shock from um, money supply, and this is shock from inflation. So the shocks, the impulse response are important. Is this, and then this, and then you have this, and then this. So these shocks are important. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. These shocks like this are important. These please are not really they can be important, but based on your Kolensky decomposition, they're actually not necessary. So I'll advise you not to report this whole block. So you report the parts that are actually important. So you go back to impulse. So our impulse is number one is the OPR. So you just click on only the OPR. OPR, let's get the shock of OPR to OPR. So this is it, the shock of OPR to OPR. Can see the results. That's what is in our table. Then you can also check OPR since it's a Kolensky, the way you ordered it. You check on LM3 what OPR is going to, the shock from OPR, what to have on money supply. You can see OPR increases itself. You can see that there's actually a decrease when OPR shocks M3. If OPR is increased, open repo rate increase, it decreases money supply. You can see what it does to money supply. Money supply decreases and decreases further in the long run. So now we can check on how it affects inflation at the same time contemporaneously. You can see how it affects inflation. You can see it decreases, though it kept inflation at steady state, and then all of a sudden it started decreasing. So that's what will happen to inflation. Inflation will keep on deepening when OPR increases. So now look at the other way around. What about for money supply shock? When that shock happens to money supply, we saw that money supply decrease. Will it actually, the shock from M3, will it actually affect inflation? That's what we will look at the second level of the shock. So now we'll look at it. That will be true. What happens to itself? You see, you can see what happens to itself. Um, you see, it's actually when the shocked itself, the shock from the money supply, it actually increased. Money supply increased. You can see, but there's a reason for this. There's actually a reason for this. There's actually a reason. There's actually an interpretation based on okay, what happens to inflation from this. So you can see the money supply pass through. It's not really, you see, it increases inflation. So M3 actually increases inflation. But if OPR is increased, it's contemporary, it actually brings a drop down on inflation. But when the shock goes through money supply doesn't really bring down inflation, it actually increases inflation. So you can see that the pass through of money supply in the Nigerian economy, there's actually an issue with that. So this is what our result is telling us. So the last part you have to estimate is the variance decomposition. Some people can do you can also do historical decomposition, but I will not bore you with that. You can do the variance composition. You can do historical decomposition to see how the shocks, the previous shocks, how they affect the model. Why variance composition is how in the future, like in the near, in the say in the medium term to long term, how it's going to affect the variable in question, how those shocks are affected. So historical decomposition is history, variance composition is like a futuristic analysis. So that's what the simple definition I can give to it. So this is it for inflation. Um, this is what is telling you shock one, shock two, shock three, how they affect inflation in the model. So you can see shock one, that shock one, which is OPR, decreases, shock two decreases, but most of the shock comes from inflation, which is the previous the previous inflation figure. So you can see that the lag of inflation has no effect on inflation. Okay, let's look at the historical decomposition. Okay, it's the same thing. Uh, yeah, structural decomposition. Okay, you can see the historical decomposition. You can see for each of the decomposition based on inflation, based on M3 and based on OPR. You can see based on it, you can see inflation is showing to have much more impact on inflation historically. Uh, you can see OPR even at a point actually decreased before coming up, but M3 has been consistent. It's actually had a spike here. So historically, that's what the historical decomposition is telling us. So it's telling you from the weight of the structural VAR, inflation from LM3. This is what inflation from LM3 looks like. This is what inflation from OPR looks like. But this is what inflation from inflation looks like. You see? So, basically, it's still telling us the same thing that inflation, the main point is that inflation actually have a though there was a time it decreased, but the peak of it is from inflation. And then the only issue is that LM3, there was a point LM3 was steady. But later on, OPR seems to be having much more effect on inflation than LM3, but still, it was on the negative side at the point. Okay, so let me take you back to the variance decomposition, the inflation I was talking about, and then let's look at the stats graph. So most time I like presenting with this. You can see it's still telling us the same thing based on the historical decomposition. And the beginning period, you can see OPR, which is the shock one, based on inflation, was actually not very. Those times was negative from the historical decomposition. With time, it started increasing at the later time, and that's the forecast we are seeing here. That with time to into OPR will still start having some impact on inflation in the long term based on our data set and the structure of and then the shock two, which is the LM money supply, you can see it has actually been increasing. It has been having a significant impact on inflation, and inflation is showing to affect itself a lot. So we are still dealing with the issue of lag inflations in Nigeria. We've not been able to anchor inflation and expectation. So which means it's trying to tell us that the lag of inflation still have impacts on inflation. I think with this will be done for structural VAR. In the next class, I will teach you how to correct for most of the issue on structural VAR, especially for serial correlation and also your inverse AR roots. So, but the other variables. If you do your analysis, your structural VAR, I don't think you have issue with shear correlation. And most of the I let you know that in VAR, the heteroscalar is not really that important. It's the same serial correlation and your inverse AR roots that are actually important. So I'll just show you how to test for it and move on from there. Thank you for listening.